Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, I have a special deck profile. As some of you may know, the primary opponent in most of the matches that I've posted is none other than Sean Montague. Sean is a close friend of mine, but Sean also happens to be the 2010 Yu-Gi-Oh! National Champion. And today I've decided to profile his first place X-Saber deck from that 2010 Nationals event. Another reason why I've elected to profile X-Sabers today is fairly recently over on PAX, both YouTube and his Twitch, I ran a X-Saber deck that would have been legal at the 2011 Toronto YCS. Obviously, the September 2011 format's becoming more popular. I elected to put together an X-Saber deck and play live on his Twitch a few weeks ago. I've had some questions about X-Sabers since then, and I've decided it's probably about time to profile X-Sabers. X-Sabers is an interesting deck in the sense that the primary cards in X-Sabers have changed over time. When X-Sabers first saw some degree of competitiveness, it first came with just really X-Saber Airbellum, and I guess to a lesser extent Gothams and Urbellum in Synchrocat from 2009. We'll talk more about Synchrocat in its own deck profile at a later point. Instead, I'm going to profile the 2010 variant of X-Sabers with cards like Emmer's Blade, TCG exclusives like Dark Soul, and the strategy that Sean took all the way to first place at the U.S. Nationals. This is one of the most misunderstood formats, in my opinion. The 2010 U.S. Nationals, and really the 2010 format in general, was an interesting format because going into it, people were prepared for X-Sabers, obviously, Infernities, which was a set of cards released right around the same time as most of the X-Sabers, primarily in the Shining Darkness, Archfiend, Necromancer, Barrier, TCG exclusive, and others. But then also some other decks. Gladiator Beast did really well at the hands of Dan Larmatina. Adam Korn also topped Nationals with Gladiator Beasts. We had decks like Frog Monarchs. We had some anti-meta decks like Gadgets. We had a variety of other ones. However, the deck to me that was actually the best deck in the room was Frog FTK. Frog FTK is going to get its own video in a few weeks. Frog FTK is one of the most underrated decks of all time. It might even be the greatest deck of all time. But not a lot of people actually ran it at this Nationals, nor did a lot of people run it as the format progressed. You'd see things like Herald of Perfection, lock decks, obviously more X-Saber decks, but the best deck in the room at the time was actually not a deck that was played by a lot of players, and I'll talk more about that when we explore this format more. Anyway, we're going to look at Sean's deck today, and it was at an interesting point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history because it's actually the only point, really, where not only were the X-Sabers at their peak with Dark Soul at its old ruling, with Gothams and Fultro and all of these power cards, but it was also at the point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Rescue Cat was still legal. Rescue Cat, obviously a very powerful card, a card that was integral in the Synchro Cat deck from the year prior, important in other decks throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but it was especially useful in this deck because it was a single monster that put two X-Sabers on the board, either double Airbellum, double Dark Soul, or one of each. When you do one of each, it then allows you to do a single card high unlight and get a search during the end phase, which is obviously very powerful. With this particular deck, though, there's a lot of emphasis on Rescue Cat. There's Summoner Monk, which has always comboed well with Rescue Cat, and then multiple copies of Gold Sarcophagus. This deck essentially activated Gold Sarcophagus in the early stages of the turn, either searched Summoner Monk, Rescue Cat, or Cold Wave, which we'll talk about in the deck profile, and told the opponent, you have 2 turns to beat me, or I'm going to put together a combination of cards that are very difficult to counteract. And as X-Sabers progressed beyond this format, obviously a Rescue Cat would eventually be banned, and X-Sabers would still be very, very competitive. They'd win plenty of events. Lazaro won a YCS in the aftermath of Rescue Cat's banning. I went undefeated in Swiss at a YCS in the aftermath of Rescue Cat's banning. So Rescue Cat was not the integral part that made X-Sabers at the end of the day. Emmer's Blades and the Dark Souls proved long-term to be equally as important, but this particular deck, at this particular time, at the hands of Sean Montague and then anyone else that ran it at that Nationals, comboed the power of the X-Saber engine with Dark Soul and Emmer's Blade and Fultro and everything in between with, still legal at the time, Rescue Cat. So in today's deck profile, I'm going to take a look at Sean's deck card for card. The only card I'm missing is a copy of Saber Slash on the side deck. Other than that, this is his exact main deck, his exact side deck, and his exact extra deck. In the few days following this video, you'll see a match between Sean and I, where I run the deck that I ran at the 2010 Nationals, which I don't think was a very good deck, but I nevertheless will run it in a match this week, the Infernity deck, and Sean will be piloting this exact X-Saber deck. All right, so we'll start the deck profile with 3 copies of X-Saber Fultro. The quantity of Fultros in X-Saber decks varied over time. Some of the more controlling variants ran 2. This deck, and as did many of the decks during the summer of 2010, elected to run the full playset of 3, When you have a card like Rescue Cat in the deck, it's really easy to put 2 X-Sabers on the board. So Fultro was less dead at this point than in any other point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history when we're talking about running X-Sabers. This deck elected to run 3 copies of X-Saber Airbellum. It was essentially a requirement in this version of X-Sabers because Rescue Cat was still legal. Once Rescue Cat was banned, people typically cut 2, if not all 3. Sometimes you like having a single copy to search because it's good to crash off an Emmer's Blade or search off a Dark Soul when you feel like you can hit a card out of your opponent's hand. But once Rescue Cat was banned, no longer were 3 required. But for this deck with Rescue Cat, we're actually going to see the full 3. This is similar to what we're going to see when we eventually profile Synchro Cat, which came the year prior during the summer of 2009. So we'll talk about 3 Airbellums a second time on this channel in the near future. From that point, we have 3 copies of the TCG exclusive at the time, X-Saber Dark Soul. Dark Soul totally changed the outlook on the X-Saber deck. It gave this deck a second name off of Rescue Cat and a name that was in and of itself incredibly potent. Back in this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, if one single Dark Soul left the field and went to the graveyard multiple times in a turn, you would get to search 1 time for each instance. So for example, if you were able to synchro with a Dark Soul, revive it with Fultro, synchro with it again, revive it with Fultro, and then perhaps even discard a card out of your opponent's hand using Gotham's effect, you would get 3 searches because this single Dark Soul went to the graveyard 3 times. They've since changed that ruling, but at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, X-Sabers are at their peak, and Dark Soul is at its peak in terms of how it was ruled. From that point on, we have 2 copies of Bogart Knight. Bogart Knight was another reason why this deck ran triple Fultro. When Bogart Knight hits the board, you can special summon a X-Saber from your hand. You are locked into X-Saber Synchro monsters from the extra deck, though. In addition to that, there were some one-of X-Sabers that Sean elected to run. We have 1 copy of Pashul, 1 copy of Full Hell Knight, and 1 copy of Emmer's Blade. These are interesting to talk about because in some of the later versions of X-Sabers, particularly after the banning of Rescue Cat, cards like Airbellum were cut in favor of more Emmer's Blade, Full Hell Knights, and Pashuls. By the end of X-Saber's popularity, cards like Emmer's Blade became near staples in 3 copies. However, during the summer of 2010, this deck could function perfectly well with only 1 single copy of Emmer's Blade. Maybe you could search it when you needed it. This deck was much faster with cards like Summoner Monk and Rescue Cat, as I'll talk about in a few moments. So Emmer's Blade wasn't a necessity when X-Sabers really started to hit their peak. Same is true with Full Hell Knight and Pashul. The primary tuner during this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history for X-Sabers is going to be Airbellum. The fact that you have a Full Hell Knight and Pashul is merely a byproduct of having a card like Dark Soul that can search whichever one that you need at a given point. As we'll talk about with later versions of X-Sabers, there's points in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where much of this deck revolves around triggering Full Hell Knight's effect as much as possible by using cards like Enemy Controller and Book of Moon to shift your opponent's monsters to defense. That was certainly something that this deck could do. It certainly has the Emmer's Blade and the Full Hell Knight, but it wasn't an emphasis for Sean and for many of the X-Saber decks at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. From there, I'll talk about the Rescue Cat package. We have 1 single copy of Rescue Cat, it was limited to 1. 1 single copy of Summoner Monk, also limited to 1. A Sangin to search out these combo pieces. And actually, of all cards, a single copy of Thunder King Ryo. The single copy of Thunder King Ryo is pretty common so that you could search it off of a Summoner Monk if you felt like that would put you in a good position. Let's say you didn't actually want to summon Rescue Cat, maybe you were going first, you know you're playing against a deck like Infernities, and you want to lock out your opponent's ability to search. You could just shotgun the Thunder King Ryo and forgo the opportunity of summoning a turn-run Rescue Cat. In addition to that, there were 2 other quote-unquote hand traps at the time, a main-decked copy of DD Crow, which is actually quite popular. In the aftermath of Nationals heading into the Shonen Jump in Indianapolis, people started to main-deck even 2 copies of the DD Crow, particularly as a counter to the Frog FTK that we'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's 1 copy of Gores. In terms of the sort of support monsters that are not X-Sabers, obviously the Rescue Cat and the Summoner Monk are critical. We'll talk a little bit about some of the combos that this deck can do towards the end of the video. If you're familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh's history at this point, you might be familiar with a deck known as Synchro Cat. Synchro Cat was a deck popular at the Nationals the year prior. Again, I alluded to that a little bit earlier, 2009. But we'll see Double Cat, Double Monk. But at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, these cards were limited to 1. We'll talk about Synchro Cat later on. But this was the monster lineup that Sean elected to run. Obviously worked out for him, seeing as how he won the event. Heading on into the spells, we're going to see an interesting spell lineup. I always found the spell lineup of this deck interesting. We'll start with 2 copies of Book of Moon. These aren't too interesting. They're generally good cards throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. This deck has a little bit of added utility because you can flip face down a monster and attack over it with Pashul, or rather with Full Hell Knight to trigger its effect. Other than that, it's just a decent card, stopping combos, stopping your opponent when they summon Rescue Cat, for example, booking one of the monsters, making sure they can't full trill you. We have 2 copies of Gold Sarcophagus. So this was an interesting inclusion and became really popular in the X-Saber deck. Essentially what this card did is if you opened with a turn 1, you either searched Cold Wave, not as frequently Heavy Storm, mostly Cold Wave, and then either Monk or Cat, and you basically told your opponent, you have 2 turns to beat me, or I'm getting one of my combo pieces, and I'm going to beat you. If you could put together these types of cards against virtually any of the decks at the point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, you're probably going to win. We'll talk about the tempo swings that these cards enabled in just a little bit. But you had 2 copies of Gold Sark, essentially telling your opponent, you have 2 turns to beat me, I'm getting an incredible combo piece after those 2 turns, and then I'm going to beat you. This deck had a lot of spell and trap card removal, but they were all actually 1-ofs, cards that were all limited to 1 at the time. We have 1 MST, 1 Cold Wave, I'm talking more about Cold Wave in a little bit, 1 Heavy Storm, and 1 Giant Trunade. This deck did have a lot of OTK potential. This deck, even if it wasn't OTKing, had a lot of tempo swings where it could make 1 giant push, summoning Cat, summoning Full Trill, getting a bunch of searches, and taking complete advantage of the match or the game. So a card like Giant Trunade was really useful in ensuring that your push went through. Cold Wave was the one that was just absolutely backbreaking. I'll talk about Cold Wave more towards the end. I'll put it over here just so that we can talk about what Cold Wave and Cat and Summoner Monk could accomplish. From that point on, we had 1 Mind Control and 1 Brain Control. This deck has quite a few tuners in it. The 3 Airbellum, the single Pashul, the Full Hell Knight, the ability to search them with Dark Soul and Ember's Blade. So the Mind Control and the Brain Control, 2 great inclusions. From that point on, we have a reasonable trap lineup. We have 2 copies of Gotham's Emergency Call. This card was incredible in the mirror match. You could special summon X-Sabers, even if you yourself did not have an X-Saber face up on the board. So this was a card that in the mirror match you had to really worry about. In the mirror match, you yourself could really orchestrate a game state where it would take advantage of things. There were times I remember back in the day where your opponent would high unlay you and target your set Gotham's Call, and then you would activate it in response because they had an X-Saber on the board. I vividly remember a game at one of my locals where my sets were Torrential and Gotham's Emergency Call. So my opponent summoned high unlay and targeted my 2 back rows. I went Chainlink 1 Gotham's because you have an X-Saber, Chainlink 2 Torrential. Torrential clears the board, and then Gotham's resolves as technically Chainlink 2 with high unlay as Chainlink 1. I get X-Sabers now on the board on a clear board. So the Gotham's was a really important card in the mirror match. It was a comeback card, it was a combo card, and it was a card that could even stymie your opponent depending on what they were doing. Then we had 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole, solid card during this point in the format. It can counteract Rescue Cat if your opponent's not using Giant Trunade or Cold Wave or Heavy Storm to push through their play. Against Infernities, which we'll talk about, obviously it can hit the Archfiend, it can slow them down a little bit there. We had a bunch of 1-ofs from that point. We had 1 copy of Trap Dust Shoot. It was limited to 1 at this point. With Heavy Storm legal, we're at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Dust Shoot's a borderline staple. It's when Heavy Storm is banned where people start to cut Dust Shoot, because then people typically set more cards on the first turn because they don't have to fear Heavy Storm. This was obviously not the case. We had a copy of Torrential, I already mentioned that. Sean elected to run 1 Starlight Road and 1 Solemn Judgment in order to set a lot of back rows without fear of Heavy Storm. Starlight Road also did a good job counteracting high unlay. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Sean also then elected to run a package that was pretty popular, the Royal Oppression Trap Stun package. What this allowed you to do would be to activate Trap Stun, even if you yourself have activated Royal Oppression earlier in the game. Shut out your Royal Oppression for the turn, make your special summons, and then end your turn. Trap Stun goes away. Now your opponent has to break your board without the ability to special summon. As you probably can guess, that can be pretty challenging to do. So this package here became a little bit more popular, quite frankly, after the banning of Heavy Storm. But in this format, it was still one of the early points in the game's history where we started to see this Trap Stun Royal Oppression combo. That is the main deck. I'm going to first talk about the extra deck, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why this deck's running Gold Sark and some of the sequences that it can do once you see the extra deck. We'll start with some of the level 5s. We have a copy of Magical Android, a copy of Ally Justice Contaster, and then the X-Saber level 5 synchro, X-Saber Wayne. You might not be familiar with Wayne. It honestly didn't come up much. It was just honestly Pashul plus a Dark Soul, or Pashul plus another level 5. It is a generic level 5, and when you special summon it, specifically synchro summon it, you can special summon a level 4 or lower warrior from your hand, of which there are several in this deck. Ones like Full Hell Knight, for example, Pashul. So it was an X-Saber that you could go into that was simply a level 5. It was technically an X-Saber name, so there may have been circumstances where you you use mind control, you use brain control, and now you're able to go into an X-Saber name, potentially allowing you to now summon Fultrol. For the level 6s, we have a Bryanak and Goyo Guardian. Goyo Guardian was legal at this point. We have, in terms of other level 6s, I guess I should mention probably the most important one, quite frankly, is 2 copies of X-Saber High Unlay. We'll talk about High Unlay in a little bit. He's going to go over in the pile with this Cold Wave package. In terms of level 7s, we have Arcanite Magician. Arcanite Magician was included because of the Summoner Monk. I'll talk a little bit about that. A Black Rose Dragon. For level 8s, we had Stardust Dragon, Colossal Fighter. Also, in terms of level 7s, we had X-Saber Urbellum. Urbellum is actually surprisingly important because its effect is marginal. When it resolves, it's actually a really exciting effect. If your opponent has 4 or more cards in hand, they have to put one back at the top of their deck. But it was particularly important because Bogart Knight requires you to go into an X-Saber Synchro monster. And if you did have something like Airbellum, for example, the only monster that you could go into was Urbellum. You couldn't Black Rose off of this. You can't go into Arcanite Magician for several reasons. You only could go into Urbellum. So it was a particularly important one, although its effect innately isn't overwhelmingly powerful. In terms of 9s, we have the Gothams and the Mistworm, and then the final one was a Chimera deck. Before I talk about the side deck, though, let's talk a little bit about some of these decks' interactions and why I'm going to call this Cat Saber instead of just X-Sabers, because although there was only one Rescue Cat, this deck did a lot to try and emphasize it. It ran, of course, the Gold Sarcophaguses, it ran the Summoner Monk, and then it ran, of course, Rescue Cat. When you summoned Rescue Cat at this point, what it allowed you to do is it allowed you to go into a Airbellum and a Dark Soul. So one card puts 2 monsters on the board. That's what Rescue Cat always has done. But now what you can do is you can immediately go into High Unlay. So you have a 1-card High Unlay that, in addition to putting a 2300 that clears your opponent's back rows, it actually now allows you to search in the end phase. So it's an incredibly game-breaking card, just having 1 single copy of Rescue Cat in your deck. So when you have a card like Summoner Monk in your deck, in addition to that, you can ditch a spell to put Rescue Cat on the board. Now the Rescue Cat can go to the graveyard with its effect, and now you can have a few different options. You can go Urbellum, Fultrol. Now you have the option here of going into a level 7. You have the option here of going into the level 6. You could go into double Airbellum if you felt like that was effective. If you had another X-Saber on the board already, maybe you can go into something like double Dark Soul. Like, for example, you could easily go Dark Soul, Dark Soul. Go Dark Soul, Dark Soul, and then special summon a Fultrol from your hand. And now special summon a Tuner from the graveyard, and now you're in incredible position. You have the ability to go into Gothams right here. You have the ability to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand and get 2 searches during the end phase. The ability to just completely destroy both your opponent's back rows with High Unlay, hand with Gothams, with 1 single Rescue Cat in your deck was just absolutely game-breaking. You could imagine this. Open with Rescue Cat and double Fultrol. I know this sounds impractical. What are the odds? You open the one of, you open the double Fultrol. But just bear with me, just to show you this deck's ability. Double Fultrol, Rescue Cat, and let's just say 3 cards that are clearly not extenders. They're not going to impact your combo in any capacity. We're actually going to discard them during this turn, and you'll see why in just a moment. So with 1 single Rescue Cat, you can activate its effect and put 2 X-Sabers on the field, which then allows you to summon both of the Fultrols that you opened with. From that point, you were then able to go into Bryanak. With that, you are then able to activate your first Fultrol's effect and revive the Dark Soul. I'm going to flip the Fultrol in this manner in order to indicate that I've used its effect. Then I'm going to use my other Fultrol to bring back the Airbellum. From that point, I am going to synchro the Fultrol and the Airbellum to go into Gothams. Gothams allows you to tribute X-Saber monsters on the board in order to discard cards from your opponent's hand. Before I go on and do that, though, I'm now going to use my Bryanak to return to my hand the already used Fultrol. I still now have 2 X-Sabers on the field, though, and I can special summon that Fultrol immediately back to the field. Then I'm going to use my Gothams to send the Dark Soul to the graveyard. I'm going to use a die, put it on top of my deck to represent how many times this Dark Soul has gone to the graveyard this turn. Remember, this is 2010. Every instance that this Dark Soul goes to the graveyard this turn is 1 search during the end phase. I've technically sent it there twice now, once off this Gothams effect and once in order to special summon Bryanak. I've also now discarded 1 card out of my opponent's hand, which I will represent with this red die. From there, I will use this Fultrol, spinning it around so that we can clearly indicate that I've used its effect to bring back this Dark Soul. Now I'm going to use Gothams to I'm now going to use Bryanak to ditch a card from my hand to put the Fultrol back into my hand and special summon it immediately to the field. Now I'll use my Gothams to send the Dark Soul to the graveyard. We're up to 3 searches end phase and 2 discards. The Full Troll then can use its effect to bring back that Dark Soul. I will discard the last card out of my hand to bounce Full Troll and then special summon Full Troll. I'll use Gothams again to ditch the Dark Soul. I'm up to 4 searches end phase. My opponent's now discarded 3 cards. I'll use my Full Troll again to bring back the Dark Soul. I have no more cards in my hand, so I cannot continue with Bryanak, but I can now ditch the Dark Soul to the graveyard. I'm up to 5 searches. My opponent's now discarded 4 cards. Now, generally speaking, if these are the 3 monsters on the field, you'd rather end with Full Troll on the board so that on the next turn you can revive a monster from the graveyard. So I'm actually going to ditch Gothams for his own effect right now and discard the final card out of my opponent's hand. I've now discarded my opponent's entire hand, and I've now received 5 searches because of that single Dark Soul during the end phase. This was about as powerful as it got. Clearly, you're not going to open double Full Troll Rescue Cat all the time, but when you did, if your opponent didn't have DD Crow, which wasn't overwhelmingly popular in and of itself, you absolutely have the ability to do a pretty awesome play. And quite frankly, even if you're not pulling off a combo of that nature, think about the tempo swing that this entails. You Gold Sark pretty early on in the game, and you go and get Cold Wave. For those of you who haven't played against Cold Wave, because it's been banned for a while, it's a card that you have to activate at the beginning of main phase 1. And what it does is, for the rest of this turn and your opponent's entire next turn, neither player can set or activate spell or trap cards. And again, we're thinking about a format where there's no effect failure. There's no max save. So if you go Cold Wave and then you summon Rescue Cat, even if your hand's not that good, you go and get a full Dark Soul and an Airbellum. You go into Hyun Lane, and now you destroy all of your opponent's back rows. Again, they can't chain any of them. It clears all of their back rows. Now you end your turn and you get a Dark Soul search, and your opponent can't set any spell or trap cards on that following turn because Cold Wave's effect affects not only just the turn that you activated it, but the turn that follows. So now you get to have another turn after a Dark Soul search, and your opponent has no spell or trap cards on the board. Imagine just the amount of tempo swings that that can cause. Previous to that, if you opened Cold Wave Cat, before the release of all of these X-Sabers, the best you could do is go into a Goyo Guardian, which isn't bad, but you really needed Cold Wave plus Summoner Monk to do anything that's over the top. Continuing on from here, though, now that you've seen a little bit of the combos from the power of Cold Wave to just the overall power of Cat double Full Troll, we can talk a little bit about what you would anticipate if you went back to play in 2010. Well, in 2010, there was actually a fairly diverse field. It didn't feel like it at the time, but in retrospect, there definitely was a fairly diverse field. There was a Rescue Cat devoted deck. It was typically called Caliber Cat, where you had Rescue Cat, you had the Airbellum, but you had cards like Doom Caliber Knight instead of the X-Sabers, so you could easily run into Caliber Cat. You could easily run into Gladiator Beasts. Gladiator Beasts were pretty common at the time. Some top players like Adam Korn and Dan Larmatina topped the Nationals in 2010 with Gladiator Beasts. We, of course, had the Mirror Match. As you might anticipate, there were a bunch of Mirror Match. We had what I think was probably the best deck at the time, though at Nationals, it was not as popular as it would be later on, which is Frog FTK. I'll talk about Frog FTK in its own video. Might legitimately be one of the most misunderstood yet powerful decks in all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. It was an absolutely back-breaking deck that a lot of people just assumed was a combo deck, when in reality, yes, it had the FTK combo, but a lot of people didn't understand how to play against it, and it could probably outgrind any deck in the format. There were matches at my locals where I would be playing with my friends and I'd say, you know what, I'm just going to side out Mass Driver, which you think is my win condition, and I'm just going to beat you with Flip-Flop Frog and Unifrog and all of the Frog effects because of how powerful Substitute was in and of itself. I'll talk about Frog FTK at a later point. From there, we had Infernities. This was another one of the decks that was released in the Shining Darkness. The set where we saw Dark Soul, we had cards like Infernity Launcher, Infernity Barrier, Infernity Archfiend had already been out. There was a pretty common Infernity deck made popular by the Canadians that you saw a lot at the US Nationals. I actually ran virtually identical deck to the Canadians. Didn't do very well, but that nevertheless was a common deck that you could run into. We had, of all things, Herald of Perfection. There was a Herald of Perfection deck that utilized normal monsters with, of course, Herald of Perfection, Archlord Christia, cards like Dark Factory to return the normals from the graveyard to the hand to create negations. Frog Monarchs top-aided Nationals. It was a deck that was pretty frustrating to play against because it had cards like Vanity's Fiend. It had a pretty decent matchup against some of the decks in the field. And then we had Gadgets. Gadgets have been a deck in, quite frankly, a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and it was just sort of always there off to the side. Anti-meta Gadget decks with a bunch of Floodgates and Floodgate monsters was something you also could theoretically run into. So we'll move some of these off to the side so that we can talk a little bit about the side deck choices that Sean made and where they fall relative to some of the decks at the time. Sean elected to side deck 2 copies of Consecrated Light. This was a pretty common side deck inclusion against Infernities. In theory, your opponent's running entirely dark monsters. In theory, if you were to summon Consecrated Light, it would make it difficult for your opponent to combo off. As somebody that played Infernities a lot, as my old friends used to call them, inferiorities, which in retrospect they definitely were relative to the rest of the field, particularly if I wanted to play combo, I should have just went with something like Frog FTK. But nevertheless, this card was pretty good against Infernities. I will say, though, as the Infernity player, though, particularly if you ran the version that the Canadians popularized with cards like Book of Moon, you had a lot of inherent outs to Consecrated Light. You also knew that it was likely coming in games 2. So you would typically consider siding things like Raiko and Raigeki Break to have universal outs to some of the floodgates that your opponent could use. Nevertheless, Sean elected to run 2 copies of Consecrated Light. He also sided 2 copies of Hanawada. This card was used specifically for the Frog FTK deck. I will say, I don't think, as somebody who later on played Frog FTK during that format, that this card was very good, primarily because that deck could still beat you easily, even if they took Mass Driver out of the deck. Mass Driver was just the fastest way to beat you, but if they were able to pull off the full Substitute combo, which ultimately resulted in 5 monsters, 5 of any frogs on the field, they're probably going to beat you, and I'll talk about why when we actually talk about frogs, but I can't even begin to tell you how many times I watched matches from afar, people playing against Frog FTK, who didn't really understand what that deck was capable of doing if it wasn't FTKing you, who would sit there and be like, wow, you're destroying my back rows, returning all my monsters to my hand, beating me down. How am I losing to this deck? You didn't actually FTK me. And the Frog player is just like, it's the best grind deck out there. It's just a grind deck that happens to OTK 30% of the time. So Hanawada, in retrospect, I don't think was a great card because that deck could easily still beat you without the FTK. But nevertheless, 2 copies of Hanawada. Copy of Cyber Dragon did good against the gadgets, particularly the Machina gadget variants that people were running. Second copy of DD Crow, this was pretty popular. I will say this card actually was good against Frog FTK. That deck typically only ran 2 copies of Ronin Tonin, and if you banished both of the Ronin Tonins, the deck could not function. That was the crippling point, banishing both Ronin Tonins. So having access to double DD Crow is important. That deck sometimes needed to dig with cards like Hand Destruction, which actually allows both players to draw 2 fresh cards. So if you had DD Crows in your deck, there was a reasonable chance that you would be able to actually draw into them by virtue of what the Frog deck was going to do. Another copy of Thunder King Ryo. Thunder King Ryo is a pretty good card against the Herald of Perfection deck because it shut down Manjus on the first turn and Senju. Obviously against cards like Machinas and Gadgets. Also did good against decks running Dark Soul, the mirror match, of course. From there were a couple copies of Pulling the Rug. Pulling the Rug was good against decks running Caius and some of the Frog Monarch decks. Of course, they could summon Light and Darkness Dragon and Vanity's Fiend, which would be a little bit annoying, but the deck is still running actual Monarchs. This card was also absolutely fantastic in the opening turns against the Herald deck. If you could turn 1 hit their Manju, that's a huge game breaker. That deck really needed to put Herald of Perfection on the board turn 1 in order to function. If they needed to sit there and kind of set things up, their cards don't do anything. They're running literal normal monsters. There's no defense, very little protection. So you could beat them pretty quickly if you stymie them early on. Sean put some Dust Tornadoes in his side deck. Card's universally great. I only have 1 copy of Crevice from the Dark Dimension, or the Different Dimension rather. I think it's Different Dimension. It's obviously in German and I can't read it, but Crevice from the Different Dimension. This card actually saw some popularity fairly recently in Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! What this does is it allows you to banish 2 monsters of the same attribute, so I'm talking Dark, Light, Earth, etc., from your opponent's graveyard. This was good against Frogs, because if you had it set turn 1, you could banish potentially both Ronin Tonins. I will say, a astute Frog player would play around Crevice in games 2 and 3 to make sure they don't expose themselves to the auto loss, which could theoretically happen if you got rid of both Ronin Tonins. Regardless of that, it was really good against Infernities. All of the Infernities that need to come out of the graveyard are going to be dark, so you can hit their Archfiend and one of their tuners and slow down their combos. And then the last card was Light Imprisoning Mirror, which was specifically for the Herald of Perfection deck. If you could get that out turn 1, you could lock your opponent out from effects. This deck doesn't really have the opportunity to side a lot of MSTs, Heavy Storms, cards like that, because in doing so, they're going to slow themselves down. They really need their cards to either put Herald on the field or be a fairy to discard Herald. You could sometimes see that deck with Royal Decree. There was theoretically a way of winning if you just went something like Decree, Archlord Christia, but nevertheless, Light Imprisoning Mirror is still a really solid choice. But nevertheless, this was the 2010 Nationals format, some of the decks that were popular, Sean's side deck, Sean's main deck, Sean's extra deck. In the future, we'll be looking at some of the other decks from this format. Like I mentioned, the Frog FTK deck's really fascinating. Looking at some of the other decks like Infernities in their first iteration, I think was also valuable. So that's it for today, though, but it's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Check back soon for an even deeper dive into the Nationals 2010 format, but also a variety of other formats. I'm going to talk about X-Sabers a few more times in the upcoming weeks.